So public relations, and public relations is a little bit of a weird animal for a number of reasons. It's actually different than journalism. It's actually sort of a hybrid of journalism and advertising. And not to go too far off topic here, but it sort of illustrates the point. Here at BGSU, public relations is in with the journalism department. And it's like that at a lot of schools. However, there are also a lot of schools where public relations is actually part of the advertising department. So it just sort of illustrates this idea that public relations is something a little bit different than what we would consider purely journalism, or at least the reporting part of journalism. So public relations it does seek to inform, but it also seeks to persuade. And in case you don't know what public relations is and how it's different from advertising, public relations is more about you feeling good about the company or the organization. So for example, Ford puts out advertising where, they talk about how you should go buy this Ford Fusion and how it flies over mountains and everything else. But then also Ford does public relations. And so Ford has people who basically put out the word about them doing good things in the community, them giving money to libraries, that sort of stuff. And so public relations is more about you feeling good about the organization or company overall rather than directly trying to sell you something. And so public relations can be a commercial entity. It can be a nonprofit. So, Easter Seals or somebody like that would have public relations. Libraries have public relations. The Toledo Lucas County Public Library has public relations. Hospitals have public relations. And, again, their job is to sort of make you feel good about the organization and also get news out about the organization. So the example that I always use is if you work public relations for a hospital, and let's say that your hospital has just hired this top-notch heart surgeon, one of the 10 best heart surgeons in the country. Well, what you would want to do is get the word out about that. You would want the news media and people to know that, hey, man, we're kicking butt over here. We've got this new surgeon. So you would work with the media to try to get the news out about that, facilitate them if they want to come interview this new guy, that sort of stuff. By the same token, though, if it turns out your hospital has a nurse who's going around and poisoning people, well, that's also something you're going to have to deal with. That's something called crisis communications, which is a part of public relations. And so you would sort of have to work both sides of the coin. So in a nutshell, public relations is kind of a hybrid. Journalism and advertising, it does cross many legal categories. So for example, there's First Amendment issues. There's also contract issues. And there's also regulations. So for example, if you do public relations in the airline industry, you're going to be affected by a lot of the regulations that affect the airline industry. So there's a lot of different stuff to consider when we're talking about public relations. So related to public relations is this idea of corporate speech rights. So do corporations have speech rights? Well, until the 1970s, there was no First Amendment protection recognized for corporate speech. However, now a corporate right of expression is recognized. And when it comes to political or social issues, there's very broad protection. And when it comes to commercial speech, as we've already seen, it's moderately protected. So what that means is there are actually more regulations about commercial speech than there are if a company wants to become involved in a political issue. So for example, if Ford wants to start a public relations campaign against some new regulation about gas mileage or something like that, that would sort of be a PR campaign, and Ford would have more First Amendment protection for that sort of thing than they actually would for their commercial speech. This all came about with this case of First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, and this involved a bank that wanted to speak on a political issue, and this protection was granted to the First National Bank of Boston, and it has later been expanded to include ideological groups and even groups or entities that don't have any business pursuits. And this has become a very big issue in this country because of the idea of corporations and even just groups of rich people getting together and spending millions and millions of dollars on political campaigns. So where we are now is that corporate speech is recognized as a First Amendment right, especially when it comes to talking about issues of social or public importance. So this idea of corporations actually having too much rights to get into the political process has been something that we've been talking about for at least a decade. And as it says here, after the Bellotti decision, corporate speech in the political arena really began to grow. Corporations began to get much more involved in the political process, spending money on particular campaigns or candidates or issues. And in 2012, Congress tried to basically reduce the influence of big money on the campaign process. They passed a bill that was later, however, struck down. And the Supreme Court actually, eventually said that, agreed with this idea that corporate political speech is protected. Not only that, this case of Citizens United, which maybe you've heard about, in 2010, the Supreme Court actually said corporations can spend as much money as they want on political messages as long as they're not directly associated with any candidate's campaign. And this whole idea of not being directly associated with any candidate's campaign is a loophole so big you could drive a tank through it. And in fact, I don't know if you were following this, but Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert actually did a takeoff on this where Stephen Colbert actually started his own campaign fund, and then he was sort of working with Jon Stewart to spend it, but they weren't actually directly associated. And so they did a whole thing with a joke about that. And so essentially where we stand now is that corporations very, very, very much have a right to be involved in the political process. And that's a pretty big deal, and I think this is going to be one of the big issues that is going to have developments of one kind or another over the next several years. So as an example of this, the difference between corporate and political speech, there's the case of Nike versus Kasky. And I never know if it's Nike or Nike. I should probably check on that since I'm going to be recording these things. But I'm going to say Nike. No, I'm going to say Nike. So anyway, let's say Nike. It's the shoe company. I'm sure you're familiar with them. They're very high profile, and they've actually come under scrutiny because people have looked at where the factories where their shoes are made and have found that, the wages are ridiculously low, the working conditions are bad. In some cases, there have been charges that they've got children working, making these shoes that then they, charge $150 for. And so Nike at some point did a campaign to try to defend itself, to basically come out and say, look, conditions in our factories aren't as bad as they're saying, stuff's not, as bad as it should be, or it's not as bad as people are saying it is. And the California Supreme Court said that this campaign was actually commercial and not political. So in this case, the California Supreme Court said what you're doing here, Nike, is not political, it's commercial. And they said that then it could be regulated and that Nike could be punished if they said false things. Nike appealed this to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to take the appeal, and the case was later settled out of court. But again, this is just sort of an example of where the difference between corporate and political speech is different. The difference is that if it's corporate speech, it can be more highly regulated as a form of advertising than if it's political speech. And we need to talk a little bit about tort law and public relations. Tort law is essentially about compensating people for losses that are the result of actions of others. So, for example, privacy and libel are both kinds of tort law. But there are specific types of tort law that apply to public relations practitioners. So, for example, interference in a business relationship. This can be if you try to get somebody to break their contract with somebody else. Like somebody already has a contract with somebody else and you go in and try to get them to break that contract. That can be an example of this. Unfair competition can be things if you do things like misrepresent yourself or your company as something that it isn't. This can be unfair competition. Duty to warn, failure to disclose. This can be things involving, like if you knew your company was making a bad product and you didn't say anything about it. And then finally, this idea of misrepresentation would essentially just be, overall misrepresenting the company or misrepresenting whatever it is that you're writing about as a PR practitioner. So these are all types of things that are specific to PR, and I should also point out that it is possible for a PR person to libel somebody. It's also possible for a PR person to invade somebody's privacy. So we do have all of those other types of law that apply to PR, and in addition, we sort of have these corporate tort law things as well. We also have contract law issues with PR. One of them is the idea of ownership of works. If you are, for example, a freelance public relations practitioner and you are hired by a company to do some PR work for them, you need to be careful about what the contract says as far as like who actually owns what you're creating. Do you own it or does the company own it? And obviously that can have issues as far as like who is actually going to control this. Also, hold harmless clauses. If you are doing freelance public relations work, you would want to have a hold harmless clause that basically says you're not responsible for lies that the company tells you. So let's say you're hired by a company to do some freelance PR work, and they're feeding you all these lies, and you're putting the stuff out there. You want to make sure that if somebody sues based on that, it's not going to be you, it's going to be the company. So that's what a hold harmless clause is about. Also, no compete clause. A no compete clause says that if you do work for this company, you're not also going to do work for another company. And this actually comes into play in broadcasting. Most broadcast reporters and anchors have a no compete clause, which means that when they stop working at this station, they're not allowed to go to the station across town. And so what has happened in a lot of cases is there has been an anchor who is let go by one station, and then they more or less have to sit out for 6 months or maybe even a year before they can go to another station in that same town. Because again, most anchors and reporters have a no-compete clause, which basically says you're not going to go work for the station that competes with us. And finally, we have confidentiality agreements. Confidentiality agreements are things that you would sign that basically say that you're not going to talk about stuff that you find out about the company. So, if you're doing PR for, Apple and they're about to come out with this crazy new product that's just wonderful, and, you're doing some PR work for it, you would not be allowed to tell people about this product, except the advertising or PR work that you would do. So confidentiality agreements basically say you're not going to talk about what these things are and things that you're learning in the course of your work. So then just some general stuff about interacting with the media. A good idea if you're a public relations person is to actually record all the interviews that you do with the media. So whenever the media comes to talk to you about something, it's not a bad idea for you to run a little recorder and record the interview as they're recording it. That way, if there's ever any question about what you said or any kind of thing like that, you have evidence. Also, PR people need to be careful about their public actions. You always need to watch what you do and say, especially if you are a full-time employee for a company and you do public relations for them. You're probably going to be a little bit known in the community. And so you basically need to be careful about what you do, what you post on your Facebook page, how you act in public, those sorts of things. So you need to be careful about your public actions. And then also this idea of off-the-record remarks, because as a PR person dealing with the media, you need to understand how journalists recognize these different categories of remarks. So first of all, there's the on-the-record remark. And on the record essentially means that you're saying something to a person in the media and that they can quote you directly and they can say your name. So they can say, Jim Faust said that, the company is not dumping poison into the Maumee River. So that's on the record. For background essentially means that you can be quoted directly, but they can't actually use your name. So for background essentially means that the media could attribute a quote, a direct quote, however, they wouldn't say your name. So they would basically say, somebody within the organization said, quote, we're not dumping, sludge in the Maumee River. For deep background means that you can use the information, but you can't attribute it to an individual. So in other words, this is the kind of deep background means you wouldn't be able to do direct quotes. You would basically just be able to write the information, but not actually attribute it to any individual person. And then finally, off the record essentially means that you can't use this at all. So off the record is something that you would tell somebody in the media, but it would be off the record, and the understanding would be that they would not use that information. And you just need to be careful about these things, and also be careful about promises of confidentiality. So you need to have a good working relationship with the media, and you need to make sure you can trust various people in the media. And this is something that you need to be aware of. So just a quick example of this, I have this story from the New York Times. In 1961, this was sort of at the height of the Cold War, and President Kennedy and Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, had a set of arms talks to talk about nuclear arms control. And this story was written in the New York Times by a reporter named James Reston, who was actually one of the best reporters in the country at the time. And so he wrote this article about the meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And you might go ahead and pause this and just read through these couple of passages that I have here, and just do a quick read of those and pause. Okay, did you pause? All right, well, if you didn't, then okay. But anyway, if you read through this, there were no media in this meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev. But you can see that this is written in a way that sort of implies that somebody was there and that they basically knew what was happening. And as it turns out, Reston's source for this story was President Kennedy. So President Kennedy is actually the one who told him everything that's in this article about what happened at this meeting. And this is an example of deep background, because President Kennedy told him these things, but these, are not actually attributed to a specific individual. They are more written in a sense of like, this is what happened. It's not attributed to a particular individual. So this is an example of, as I said, deep background, where Kennedy's name is not mentioned here as a particular source. In fact, no particular source is mentioned. The story is just written using the information that was given on deep background.